I need to have to see, that's right.
All right, Genesis chapter 41 it is then. And those that are not here will have to watch the video to catch up. All right, now, as you will recall, we had left off with Joseph being appointed as the prime minister of Egypt. Now, of course, we know they didn't call it prime minister, but you get the idea that he was second in command of all Egypt except for Pharaoh himself. And they had begun at this point to collect a 20% tax on all of the harvest from each growing season, because Joseph had told Pharaoh, you got 7 years of good, productive crops. Now, I'd like to point out one thing here that a lot of times we overlook. We think of this as 7 years of a harvest and then 7 years of famine. I would propose to you that these first 7 years were not your average harvest. If Joseph instructed the Egyptians to collect and save 20% of the harvest, not half of it, because you would think, okay, we got 7 good years, we're going to have 7 bad years. We need to set aside half of the harvest. But he didn't. He just told them 20%. And after the 20%, a few years of that, our previous passage where we had left off, in fact, in verse 49, it said that their storage silos were overflowing to the point they had to stop measuring it. That tells me that God did not just give them 7 years of a normal harvest. This was 7 years of a really exceptional harvest.
Joseph's prophecy was abundance.
Abundance, followed by 7 years of famine. So, the question we have to ask ourselves is, and we looked at this briefly on Wednesday, why did God bring all this about? Why have 7 years of famine? Well, it was the one thing that would force Jacob and his family to go to Egypt for a while, which would fulfill what God had told Abraham 3 generations prior to this, that merely a year or two of a short harvest or a famine that only lasted for a few seasons wouldn't have done it. On the other hand, we can still see, God's hand in this, in that, as I mentioned, this wasn't the first 7 years, not 7 years of a normal harvest, but God took care of them by providing them with as you mentioned, an abundant harvest for that 7 years. So all this whole thing, this 14-year period, was designed with one thing in mind: to get Jacob and his family to Egypt. Because now, yes, God could have told Jacob, I want you to go to Egypt, but the question we have to ask ourselves, I think, a twofold question. Number one, did Jacob have the faith at that point to go to Egypt because God told him to? And, now you see why I always keep something to drink with me. Now, two, even if Jacob did, in fact, if he had grown in his faith by this point, that he would be willing to obey God, that would then lead us to the second issue is, what about the rest of Jacob's family? Because you got, at this point, 11 brothers, their wives, their kids, and of the older ones, maybe Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, they probably by this point were old enough not only to have kids, but probably grandkids. And if Jacob were willing to go to Egypt based on the fact that God said, okay, Jacob, I want you to go to Egypt now, the likelihood that Jacob could have uprooted the rest of the extended family probably wouldn't have happened. So God orchestrated this to get all of them into Egypt. All right, now, having set that up, let's look at verse 50. Now, before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potipherah, priest of On, bore to him. And Joseph named the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. Now, we see 2 things in this. Number 1, Manasseh is not an Egyptian name. This is a Hebrew name, and it does in fact mean to make forget. So, looking at the first part, the fact that he gave his sons Hebrew names in Egypt, married to an Egyptian priest's daughter, what do you think is going on behind, and when I say behind closed doors, don't let your mind go off into strange things here. I'm just saying the family conversations that took place. What do you think is going on behind closed doors at Joseph's house that his wife would have been willing to name their sons by Hebrew and not Egyptian names?
He's bringing her to God.
She's planning on moving on. She don't plan on staying there forever.
Well, that and the fact that, as Meryl just mentioned, she's the daughter of the priest of the sun god. It's highly likely that prior to their marriage, Asenath probably didn't know anything about the Hebrew God. So the fact that he is now introducing her to the Hebrew language, I'm sure that he probably was teaching her Hebrew at home. I mean, gave their son a Hebrew name, and we know later on that apparently she's part of the overall Jacob family. But is it possible during this time that she is being introduced to the true God in spite of her upbringing? That's number 1. Second thing, even though Joseph clearly is still a servant of the true God, notice what he names his oldest son. He makes me forget. What is it Joseph wants to forget?
His trouble. The past.
Yeah, Joseph is at this point in his life, he'd rather leave the rest of his family behind. He's still holding on to his Hebrew heritage. He's still serving the true God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But he really is trying to set himself up at this point not to be reminded of his Hebrew heritage. It's like he doesn't want to forget it on the one hand, but all of what his brothers and the family did to him several, 13 years previous, he'd rather leave that behind. He does not want to be reminded of it. And that is, in fact, the reason he names his son Manasseh, that meaning he makes me forget. But it continues on. Verse 52. And he named the second Ephraim, for he said, God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. And yes, Ephraim literally means fruitfulness. So he wants to forget, and he sees now God's given me 2 kids. Now there's
I've got a new life here. That's
got a
what he's
new
thinking.
life. Now it's interesting too, consider this. Now, a lot of times we don't, this is not a detail that we tend to even think about, but it is very much there. We've got looking down the road about 350, 400 years later, the descendants of the tribe of Joseph. By the way, in some list of the tribes of Israel, you'll see Joseph listed. In other lists, you see the tribe of Manasseh and Ephraim listed. Why at that point later on down the line does Joseph kind of drop out of the tribal listings and his two sons are listed as patriarchs of the tribes of Israel?
Double blessing.
There you go. Joseph was not the firstborn, but what was he the firstborn of?
Of Rebecca.
The favorite wife. And later on, when Jacob and the family do move to Egypt, who assumes the responsibility of caring for the family?
It's Joseph.
Joseph does. And well, of course, we know at this point there is no law of Moses. That doesn't come for another 400 years. But there were already traditions and oral laws in place, many of which we see later reflected in the law of Moses. But there were already customs, traditions, oral laws in place, even at this point. And one of those was that the oldest son, and this is the case with Joseph, whichever son wound up caring for the aging parents, inherited a double portion of the family inheritance. So all of Jacob's inheritance later on down the road gets divvied up not 12 ways, 13 ways. Because the other 11 brothers all receive one portion of the inheritance, but guess who gets two portions? Joseph does. And those two portions go to Manasseh and Ephraim. And that is the reason why in many tribal listings, even though the actual patriarch of that tribe was Joseph, you see Joseph representing two tribes, and those two tribes named after his sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Now, I tell you that for this reason. What that tells us is that of those two tribes and any intermarriage that went between those two tribes and the rest of the tribes, because occasionally, let's say, a man of the tribe of Judah might marry a wife who is from Ephraim. What genetics do we see here? Half of those two tribes genetically were Egyptian. We don't often think about that, but they were of Egyptian lineage. Not just Semitic, but Egyptian.
Descendants of Ham.
Mm-hmm. Didn't think about that, did you?
No. So Moabite blood comes into the line, but Egyptian blood also.
Egyptian blood also. Not in the tribe of Judah, but any women from those two tribes would have been half Egyptian.
So
Now,
a trickle of Egyptian blood probably remains in,
I'm
in
sure.
the Hebrew line.
Now, why is this important theologically speaking? You know, God told the Israelites when the law of Moses came 400 years later, said, absolutely you will not marry outside of Israelite blood. But God put an exception to that. He said anybody, and in fact I addressed that in my sermon this morning with Ruth, who was a Moabitess. Anybody that declares that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is their God, legally were no longer of whatever lineage they came from. They were adopted into the nation of Israel. So ethnically, they could be anything, but theologically and legally, they were now Israelite. Why is that important? Because it tells us that even though God chose Abraham, and he told Abraham, the promised line will go through your chosen son Isaac, and from him through Jacob, and from Jacob to Judah. It was, that wasn't arbitrary, but the point is that that was God's choice, not just a matter of lineage. There were numerous exceptions. Joseph's wife, who of course, even though Joseph was not the chosen tribe, there would have been wives from that tribe that would have intermarried back and forth to the others. So over a period of several generations, you'd have had Egyptian blood trickle down through all of the 12 tribes. With Ruth, you had a Moabite directly in the Messianic line. What happened when the Israelites conquered Jericho?
There was, what's her name?
Rahab.
Rahab, that's
Prostitute.
Rahab, who was a Canaanite prostitute. But even though she was a prostitute, she declared her faith in the true God. She said, I know your God, is in control here. And I want to be a part of your nation. So she was adopted into the Israelite nation. And we're told, guess what? She became part of the tribe of Judah. And also, even before Ruth was in the Messianic line. So there were exceptions, and it was not so much a matter of ethnicity as it was theological.
During the 400 years that they were in Egypt, that was prior to the prohibition on marrying outside of the tribe. So would others have taken Egyptian wives over that 400 years?
That's entirely a possibility. We just don't know. But yes, there is a good possibility that
There's a fair amount of Egyptian blood mixed in.
well, even Moses, his wife, while she was an Egyptian, Moses' wife was not an Israelite.
Right?
Yeah, his first wife was a Midianite, who was a descendant of Ishmael. So we have a lot of exception to this. The one common denominator that they all have is they all profess their faith in the true God. And that is what made the difference. All right, back to our passage of Scripture. Verse 53. When the 7 years of plenty, which had been in the land of Egypt, came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, just as Joseph had said, then there was famine in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. So notice this famine was not just confined to the Nile Valley. This famine went all the way up into Canaan, and that is why here a few years after, well, not even a few years, a few months, I should say, after this, Jacob sends his sons to Egypt to get food because they find out that this famine is widespread and the only place anybody's got any food is Egypt. So when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried out to Pharaoh for bread, and Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph. Whatever he says to you, you shall do. When the famine was spread over all the face of the earth, then Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, and the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Now, two things here. This says the famine was over all the face of the earth. Now, this is one of those things where we can take this two ways. Was there literally a worldwide famine? Or as how God has revealed this to Moses when Moses committed this to writing, did it mean that it was over all the known earth, which would have been Canaan, the Euphrates Valley, Egypt? We don't know. Question is, does it really matter?
Nope.
No, doesn't really matter. So, but I point this out because sometimes people say, oh, here, you got a mistake in the Bible. It's one of those things where Moses, maybe he was speaking literally, maybe he was writing figuratively. It frankly doesn't matter because that wasn't even the point of the story. All right. But what we do see in verse 56, notice what Joseph did. This 20% grain tax that he had been enacting on everybody the previous 7 years, does he just pull out the grain and start handing it out?
No, he sells it.
Sells it. Joseph is not stupid. He's selling this grain, which also means from Pharaoh's perspective, what happens?
He's building the coffers.
Pharaoh's looking at Joseph and said, I got the right man for the job. That guy's making me filthy rich. What's that? All right now. I have a feeling that at this point, Joseph probably couldn't have been in the better graces of Pharaoh at this point. Because Pharaoh probably, when he called for an accounting of however much, so how much did we get this year? I can't even begin to imagine. It's like, well, let's see here. Pharaoh got rich off of this. Verse 57 said, and the people of all the earth came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe in all the earth. All right, and that is what sets the stage at this point for Jacob's family to go to Egypt, which we will see in chapter 42, but that will be a fulfillment of what God had told Abraham when he told Abraham, says, I'm going to give this land to your descendants, but it'll be after they spend 400 years in slavery. They certainly would not have gone to Egypt voluntarily. And what's interesting is if God had told Abraham 3 generations earlier that, by the way, your family is going to spend 400 years in slavery in Egypt, do you think that particular detail had been passed down? Oh, I bet it was. I bet you Isaac and Jacob both knew that little detail, which might have explained why Jacob was a little reluctant to go down there, because he's thinking, well, Grandpa Abraham was told we'd be in slavery for 400 years. I don't think I want to go down there. But later on, we see he finds out my own son Joseph is the one orchestrating all of this. Hey, we got nothing to worry about. And he finds out, of course, afterward. And of course, Jacob and that first generation would have been long gone by the time that the Pharaoh that didn't know Joseph rose to power. So, all of that just to say every single detail of this. It's just any one single detail had changed, none of this would have happened. What does that tell you about the God we serve?
He's in control.
He knows exactly what he's doing. We think, oh, God's just concerned with the big picture. No, God's concerned with the details too. We just have to remember to give him credit and realize that God knows all the details, even the ones we don't. All right. Questions? All right. So